All right, we're going to go ahead and call this session to order. First off, I want to remind everyone that this is an ISRI event, and at all ISRI events, all antitrust rules apply, which means I know many of you want to know where the market is going and what the Midwest Premium is going to be doing. There's only one person who can give you his opinion on that, and that will be our analyst. I'll introduce Jason Shanker in a little bit. And no one can, from the audience, comment their opinion on where they think prices are going. So please resist the urge to comment on that. So we did have another speaker today who unfortunately flew all the way out here to Vegas and is laid up in his hotel room with the flu. And so if we have time, we might add a kind of very quick presentation at the end. We'll see. So our first speaker, many of you have heard him before. He is incredibly engaging and really one of the best aluminum analysts in the world. And just ask him. Jason Shanker is the chief economist of Prestige Economics. Bloomberg News has recognized Jason's forecast accuracy in 40 different categories for economic indicators, foreign exchange rates, energy prices, metal prices, and agricultural prices. In total, Bloomberg News has ranked Jason as the #1 forecaster in the world in 24 different categories for his accuracy. Jason's also the chairman of the Futurist Institute, which helps analysts and economists become futurists. If I could have everyone please welcome Mr. Jason Shanker.
Matt, thank you very much. And thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here today talking to my friends at ISRI. You know, my first ISRI meeting was in 2005, so I've been to quite a few of these and been coming for quite a while. And in all the years I've been an economist, which stretch even back before that, I've never seen the kind of volatility and uncertainty and risk in what's going on right now, not just in metals markets, but everywhere. As Matt mentioned, we've got a pretty good track record for forecasting aluminum prices. We've been top ranked by Bloomberg every year since 2011 for our accuracy. And even still, I would say there are times when it's easier to be a forecaster, which I would say is pretty much every time I've ever worked except now. And there are tougher times. But right now, I think it comes down to 4 numbers. If you want to know what's going on with aluminum and you want to understand what's going on in the global economy. I know sometimes I put slides up, there's a lot of numbers, people in the back can't see. I hope you can see these 4. Because these are the 4 numbers we're going to talk about. 3.9, 2.9, 120, and 0. So let's talk about the 3.9. You know, I've had a number of conversations since I've been here, and I've said to people, you know, this would have been a much more fun presentation to give in January. Because in January, the IMF released their global growth forecast, which showed that 3.9% was the expected growth rate for global GDP in 2018 and 19. Those are their forecasts. They actually released their forecast this morning, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But these are actually the forecasts from this morning. They left them unchanged, 3.9% for 18 and 19 for the global economy. And aluminum, like most industrial commodities, is bought and not sold. The demand side is critical for the market, which is why when China went into a manufacturing recession and spent 18 of 19 months between December of 2014 and June of 2016 in a recession, that aluminum took a big hit. Not just aluminum, but oil prices, copper, lead, zinc, nickel, tin, rubber, any industrial commodity you could think of. Because the global economy is what will drive prices at the end of the day. And there were no risks of trade. There was just 3.9% growth outlook. Also in January, in the US, the Atlanta Fed back in January released their forecast of what they think will be in Q1. I don't know if you know this, but there are 3 different central banks that release what are called nowcasts. They are forecast estimates of what the current quarter GDP will be based on the most recent data. People often say that weathermen exist to make economists look good. And it's generally true, but these kinds of models are actually based on weather models that are designed to be, in the near term, very predictive. In January, the Atlanta Fed's nowcast for the first quarter showed GDP would be 5.4%. The number hasn't been released yet, but as you can see from the green line that falls throughout the chart, the current forecast for the first quarter is only 2%. A lot weaker level of growth than was expected just a few months ago for the quarter in which the data was being released. So in January, much better outlook. The other thing that's really important is what's been driving the growth forecast for the global economy. This is actually a table that was released in the IMF reports earlier today about global growth. And there's a red line and a blue line. The red line is world trade. The blue line is industrial production. What you'll notice is in the second half of 2017, when growth was really strong, global growth at 3.8% for the year, the strongest level in many years. And it was strong because trade was strong. So that's the outlook as it stood in January. And of course, some of the graphs for today, and the outlook has remained unchanged. We'll talk about that in a minute. 2.9 is the other number. This is a number not easily fixed. This was the initial level of wage inflation seen in the jobs report for the month of January that came out at the beginning of February. That level of inflation was surprising, and that triggered a sell-off in multiple asset classes. You might remember at the beginning of February, equity markets fell, bond prices fell, oil prices fell, aluminum prices fell. Pretty much everything fell except the dollar. In other words, everyone was going to cash. Not because of trade. The words tariffs and trade weren't really in anyone's focus. 99% of the world had never heard the numbers 232 or the word Rusal. This was Fed policy expectations, that there would be more rate hikes coming. And we've had a slower growth outlook for next year anyway. For a year, we've expected 4 rate hikes this year, whereas most people have only been expecting 2. And in February, that changed. The labor market's tight. We did a quarterly benchmarking like we always do, and in the first quarter, in January, we conducted it. We asked our clients about almost 20 different categories of risk. And we say, what do you assess on a 5-point scale? What do you think? And then we weight them against each other. The biggest risk in 9 quarters, over 2 years, labor costs. That was in January. By the way, at the national level, the Business Roundtable, the group of 100 CEOs who advises policy leaders at the national level in DC, CEOs of the biggest companies in the country, they also conducted that survey, and for the first time in years, their response was labor costs was their number one biggest risk to their business in the next 12 months. That was in January. So when the numbers came out in February, we weren't too surprised. But here's the thing, that 2.9%, that's the camel's nose under the tent. There's more inflation to come. This is a CPI graph, and I know some of you who might be sort of sticklers for discussions about Fed policy. I don't know how many econometricians we have in the audience. You might be quick to say the Fed doesn't care about the CPI. The Fed cares more about something called the PCE, the personal consumption expenditures kind of inflation. But here's the thing, labor contracts, vendor agreements, and even the most recent tax reform bill included references to the CPI. It's important for businesses. The Fed's target for inflation is 2%. That's the red line there. This is the March level of inflation. You'll notice something quite conspicuous. Both the blue line and this other purple line are above that 2% level. The blue line is total inflation. The purple line is inflation excluding food and energy. They're going up. Producer inflation was at 3% in March as well. But that's not the scary part. The camel's nose under the tent sort of thing. You see how the levels of inflation on the left side of the graph are kind of low. Those are low year-over-year rates. We call this a base effect because there's an underlying index that goes into calculating year-over-year inflation. And if last year was a really low level, but there's been a lot of inflation since, you could get these year-over-year numbers being much higher because last year looked much lower. It'd be like if this year your company would grow 1% and next year you were to grow 10%, but the next year you would only grow 2%. You would see what looks like a big drop-off, even though over a 3-year period it looks like there's been growth. That's a base effect, and we're above the Fed's target. And there's more inflation to come. You've heard it's been coming, it's coming. So as we think about what's going on with corporations, the risk here is that more inflation from labor costs also results in higher interest rates. So as you think about a company, what's going on? Well, your costs are going up. You're paying more for people, and you're at risk of either not getting the people you need and foregoing potential business, or paying too much, or busting the entire salary categories you have throughout your whole business, and giving up some of your profitability to continue to operate and to take on new orders at maximum capacity. We'll talk about the implications of that in a second. But the cost of labor is going up, interest rates are going up, which means your cost of capital is going up. 120. For 4 years, we've watched equity markets. This is today's chart. And there's been a blue line here that over a 4-year period we've said is the most important floor for trading equity markets. It's the 120-day moving average. On February 9th, after this jobs report came out, you saw that this took a hit in the days after that report. It came out at the beginning, but on February 9th, we dipped below the 120-day moving average. There wasn't a close. Closes started coming in March after the tariff problems. Want to know the last time it closed below the 120-day moving average? Last time it closed, the last time it even traded below it was November 7th, the day before the presidential election in 2016. Now, we can talk about technical trading. I know most of the people in this room are fundamental people. You're looking at supply, you're looking at demand. But there's a lot of folks who have computer programs, and when the computer program hits a trigger, it pulls a Jim Cramer, right? Buy, 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 sell, sell, sell. And the computer kind of runs itself. That's the majority of major trading out there. It affects equity markets, it affects metals. And so for the last couple of weeks, we've been below that level. Today, we're back above it. That's quite a good sign. But what you'll also see is there's this kind of a convergence, that black triangle in the graph. And even if all the trade stuff went away tomorrow, those inflation and interest rate risks would still be there. Now, we do a lot of different analysis every week. I'm looking at aluminum, fundamental, and technical analysis. You kind of have to do both. In May 2015, there was this kind of thing called a head and shoulders reversal. We warned our clients about it. In September 15, the technicals were bearish still. Aluminum is a very technically driven market. And in January 2016, we warned our clients that there was a bottom, which there was. But you can see on the left, there's still that head and shoulders reversal. That first formation with the little blue line. The reason I put this up is because if we look at a graph now, that little blue line is still here in the graph, but look how much smaller that important move was that triggered the sell-off as part of that Chinese manufacturing recession. It's right there, that little blue line. You can just barely see it. And now there's this trend higher that looks like it's now going to continue. But I would offer a word of caution about this, which is that, as I said at the beginning, aluminum, like industrial commodities, is bought and not sold. The demand side of the market is going to be critical for continued support of prices. So the pullback that you see on the right, where the black line, which is the monthly pricing, falls sharply, that's the concern that global growth will slow because of tariffs, because of the tit-for-tat escalation in tariff retaliations that's going on could slow growth overall in the economy. The bounce is a supply disruption concern for Rusal at a time when the market was extremely short because the global economic outlook is a bit more in doubt. And the trick, though, with tariffs is they're like cockroaches. There's never just one. So let's talk about the last number, 0. Now, this is the amount of weight that the Fed gave to trade risks in their own forecasts that were released on March 21st. In the press conference, the new Fed chair, Jay Powell, said, "Hey, at the Fed, we don't do trade policy." Essentially, not my problem. We don't do that here. What economists call ceteris paribus, which means, excluding the trade risk, we're going to have a great year. They even raised their GDP forecast with the disclaimer that trade was something they agreed to not even consider. 0 is also the amount of weight that the IMF gave to trade risks, even though the IMF head has given multiple speeches about the economic risks of protectionism, about the economic risks of tariffs, and about the potential for this to turn into more of a broader conflict on trade. The risks were acknowledged in the IMF released forecast today, also raising their U.S. GDP forecast for the year to 2.9. Again, ceteris paribus. Excluding trade, it's going to be a great year, but the trade thing, if that's bad, we'll come back and revise the outlook later. But here's the thing, 0 is also the number of people that the president needs to consult with when issuing new tariffs. Most people don't know this. A senator imparted this to me last month in a trip to DC, specifically on trade issues, that the president has unilateral ability to issue trade policy without consulting the legislative branch of government. That's the Constitution, that's the deal. So the risks, quite high. And 0 is also 2 other numbers. This is the New York Empire Manufacturing Index. The monthly drop, this was released, there's 2 numbers up here. This was released yesterday. The red line is the expectations for growth 6 months from now. The blue line is the current activity. Current activity remained relatively the same, but the red line, as you can see, had a pretty big drop. There's been no other times where the drop's been bigger since September 2001, other than the drop this month. And of course, it's the New York Empire Manufacturing Index, so that makes a lot of sense. But even during the Great Recession, there was no drop this big. None. You might say that maybe New York manufacturers are alarmist and everything's going to be fine, and the premier of China and Putin and Trump are going to sit around a campfire with some s'mores and hold hands and sing Kumbaya any day now. And it could happen, but there's one more 0 that won't go away. This is productivity. Determines kind of how much extra you get when you hire a person. It was also 0 in the 4th quarter of last year. Even if everything were perfect with trade, companies are facing higher labor costs, no productivity gains, higher interest rates, and higher materials costs. Those are the facts, even if we exclude the trade risk, which I don't think we should. Those are important risks to consider. You've heard we've been ranked at some stuff, and here's our disclaimer. And with that, I know you're reading it diligently. I'll be happy to pass off to Mr. Liu, and I thank you all very much.
Nice work.
Thanks. Mr. Liu, thank you.
Yeah, that's good.
I don't know if this violates antitrust or not, but that was a little bit more depressing than I expected. Thank you. I did a cardinal sin of moderating, and in the beginning, I forgot to introduce myself, so I'm about to introduce our next speaker, but for those of you who don't know me, I'm Matt Kripke. I'm the president of Kripke Enterprises in Toledo, Ohio, Boca Raton, Florida, and Jackson, Tennessee. Leo Wei has over 20 years experience in non-ferrous metals. He started his career in 1991 in the copper industry, which at a company that is currently owned by Chinalco, correct? He worked as a business consultant for 8 years, mainly focused on manufacture and resources. Leo joined CMRA, which is a trade association. It is the China Non-Ferrous Metals Industry Association in 2001, and he is now the Deputy Secretary General in charge of Research and Consulting Department and overseas affairs. Leo has a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering and an MBA degree from Renmin University of China. I know a lot of you have interest in what is going on between the US and China in trade, so hopefully Leo is going to talk about that a little bit. If you could please help us welcome him to the stage.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. First, I want to thank Matt for the introduction, and also it's an honor to be here, invited by the ISRI to give a presentation. You know, it's the first time to give a presentation on ISRI conference in English. So I hope you can understand my English. My English is not very good as Jason and Matt, but I think I'm Chinese is better than you. Okay. Okay, maybe next time when you go to our CMRA conference, you can give a presentation in Chinese. Okay. And today my presentation about 3 parts. First, I would like to give a brief introduction of the secondary aluminum industry in China. And second, I want to give some policy analysis, some important policies I think everybody are very concerned about, care about. And finally, I give a brief summary. And
we're not getting the
okay.
on the screens up front.
Okay.
There they are. Thank you.
Yeah, it's okay. And the first, you can see the output of the second aluminum in China over the last 10 years. And you can see that over the last 10 years, the output is increased very fastly, in about 10% CAGR, more than 10%. And also, in these 10 years, you can divide these 10 years by 2 parts, 2 phases. The first phase is from 2008 to 2011. This phase grows very quickly. It's about 20% year-on-year growth or 30% year-on-year growth. And after 2011 until now, the growth rate of the output is very steady. It's about 7%, 8%, and 7 to 10% annually. So how long will this growth last? I think from my point of view, and I think for the next few years, I say about 5 years or 7 years, I think the annual growth of the output can be above 6 to 7%. And also there are about 4 important industry clusters in China. You can see from the picture of the dark blue area. That means in the Bohai economic rim and in the Yangtze River Delta and in the Pearl River Delta, and also in Chengdu and Chongqing. These areas are also most developed areas in China, which is motorcycles, automobiles, and the manufacturers are very important. So our secondary aluminum companies are also located in this area. And also, we can see from the scrap supplier, the top 3 important supplier of the aluminum scrap are America, Hong Kong, and Australia. I think most of the, I think you all know that most of the Hong Kong scrap are also from USA and Europe countries. So USA has to be the #1, the most important supplier of the aluminum scrap. And also, we can talk about later that the tariff policies will give a great influence on this. And also, we can see the policy. You know, during the last 12 months, there are many important policies released about the solid waste import and the scrap import, and also the tariff of the aluminum scrap. And I think the most important policy is this one. This one was effective in the end of the 2016. But this is, I think this is a guideline of all the policies. And this policy's name is very long, but it has 3 important keywords. The first, I think, is the implementation plan. When you use this word in Chinese, it's 实施方案, implementation plan. In Chinese context, when you said when a policy was named by an implementation plan, that means it has a very clear objective. It has a very clear and specific goals to be achieved. And it has a special department to be responsible, to be in charge of. And also, it has a timeline. It has a timeline to finish this plan, to achieve these goals. So this plan is very specific. I will explain more details of some important parts. And also, this plan is concerned about the foreign garbage. In Chinese, it's 洋垃圾. You know, it's to ban the import of the foreign garbage, but it's not to ban the import of the solid waste. Maybe in the ordinary people, they cannot say the difference between the garbage and the solid waste. But I think in the government and in the industry, they can tell it very clearly. And also, this policy is aimed to reform the solid waste import management policy. It's not to ban to cancel the solid waste importment. That's very important. And the first important thing about this policy, I think, is significantly reduce the quantity of the important solid waste. So you can see from the graph that in the last several years, the quantity of the imported solid waste in China are declined very quickly. But the government don't think this speed is acceptable. They want to increase more. So you can see the policy influence in this year, and the total imported waste declined by 54%. This is the total solid waste. But for the non-ferrous scrap, the influence are not so much. For the aluminum scrap, it's also about 9% drop. And the second important thing said in this policy is Category 7 scrap will be cancelled by the end of this year. So what's the influence of the Category 7 scrap? So you can see the diagram in the last 5 years. The share of the Category 7 in the total aluminum scrap imported in China, the percent is steadily grows, except the 2016 is very high. I can't figure out the exact reason, but the data shows it's very high. It's over 40%. But now it's about 30%. 30% of the Category 7. So if this policy effective by the end of this year, it is, according to our estimation, about 500,000 tons of the supply will be reduced. This 500,000 tons is about metal tons. It's not the quantity, it's metal tons. It's including the aluminum scrap, it's including the copper scrap and other some hardwares and electronic motors scrap. So it's the total estimation is about 500,000 tons. And the third point, I think, is to gradually stop import the solid waste, which can be replaced by the domestic scraps by the end of next year. So stop import the solid waste. It has a condition. It must be replaced by the domestic sources. So when we look back to the aluminum scrap, I don't think the domestic resources can totally replace the imported scrap. So you can see from the graph that the percent of the domestic scraps in China is growing very fast. It's about, I think last year is about, it's near 70% of the scraps are recycled domestically. But as I mentioned before, the growth of the second aluminum output is grows very fast. It's at about 7% growth. So only the domestic scraps are not sufficient for the total industry. We have to import some aluminum scraps to meet the industry need. So I think in the foreseeable future, we still need to import the aluminum scraps. And another important policy is about the environmental standard of the imported solid waste. This policy is a supporting policy to the next one, to the last one. Last one is the key policy. It's a top policy, and this policy is to supporting this. And I think the most important things of this policy is the carried waste. I was asked by many people that what the carried waste means. So there is a definition in this carried waste, but you know, it's not very detailed and not very specific. So maybe there is a misunderstanding or confusion of this definition. But in literally, this carried waste are any foreign substance introduced into the imported scraps, excluding the packaging materials. But the solid waste can also be divided into two parts. The first part, which mainly focus on the hazardous waste, should be less than 0.01%. Should be less than this. And for the most of the carried waste, for example, plastics, paper, wood, which was mixed in the aluminum scrap, should be less than 1%. Before this, the standard is about 2%, and now it's only 1%. And this policy is effective on March 1st of this year. And also, CMRA is very cared about this policy, so we ask several important importers in China what's the influence of this policy when they effective. And many companies feedback that they have the new contract they signed with the foreign suppliers, that they already asked them to provide the more clean scrap, which maybe need to be pre-sorting in overseas. And I think at present, the pre-shipment inspection by CCIC is more strict than before. But according to our understanding, according to the feedback of our memberships, member companies, there are no return, no rejection of this of the scraps according to this policy. And the last policy, I think, is the tariff on the aluminum scrap. This was taken effect on April 2nd, and this is a 25% tariff. And I think this is a much more important policy, which this is a unprecedented situation we will face. So what's the impact of this policy? We still have to be assessed, and because we don't have enough information. As far as I know, that all the contracts will be reviewed by all our importers. Maybe some contracts, if they can cancel the contract, so they will cancel the contract. If can't, they have to accept the contract, and the total cost of the increased cost of this is about in RMB is about 3,000 RMB per ton. So I think they will be very careful to sign the new contract. So in the next few months, maybe the aluminum scrap imported from USA will be declined very sharply. But I don't think the total amount will be very different, different from the above, comparing with the last year, because for this policy, it also has some ways to deal with. First is processing trade. You know, about 10% of the China aluminum, secondary aluminum are in processing trade. That means about 500,000 tons per year, more than 500,000 tons per year. And the processing trade are not affected by this policy. So this year may be more processing trade. There may be more processing trade, and also if they can try to avoid this tariff by the re-exports, or they can find some alternative suppliers. So the total amount of the important aluminum scrap maybe not declined very sharply, but it's not a good news for the American supplier. And finally, it's about a brief summary. And according to my understanding, the China secondary aluminum industry is still vibrant despite all these uncertainties. And you know, from last year, there are many uncertainties took place in China, especially in the policy area. So, but I think the industry still have enough energy to cope with it, to deal with this, to overcome all the uncertainties, and also to maintain the relatively strong growth. Second, I think more and more Chinese companies, secondary aluminum companies, are concentrated, are focused on the domestic recycling, other than foreign suppliers. You know, in the as I said before, in the for example, 10 years before, 5 years before, the imported scraps are very important for there to get a steady, cheap supplier overseas. But now they have to find more and more sources domestically. And also the third, many companies are looking for the investment opportunities, mainly on the countries which along the Belt and Road initiatives. That means in the Southeast Asia and in other countries. And finally is also the processing trade. And because of the tariff effect, the processing trade may be increased this year. And the last is just about several seconds to introduce our CMRA. We are a national association which focuses on the non-ferrous metals recycling. And we also have a very good relationship with ISRI for many years. So every year we also have a convention in China, which is about 17 years. So I would like to take this opportunity to invite all of you to attend our conference, to join us with in November 7th to 9th in Guangzhou, China, to attend our conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Because we had a speaker cancel, I'm going to go ahead and buzz through. Those of you, I apologize to those of you who are at Platts. I did a presentation in January on auto sheet in the North American scrap market, and I'm going to go ahead and buzz through that real quick since we have a little bit of time. I will do the abridged version for Edward and the other people that already have seen this, so you're welcome. So Kripke Enterprises was founded in 1993 by my parents, Larry and Joni Kripke, celebrating our 25-year anniversary. And we are headquartered in Toledo with trading offices in Boca and also Jackson, Tennessee, which is our coil division. Some of you know some of those guys in the pictures, our trading team, along with our CFO. Today, last year, I should say, we recycled over 170 million pounds of scrap and sold over 25 million pounds of coil, with combined sales of over $165 million last year. I'm showing this to give you some basis for what we're going to talk about with the auto sheet. We now have actually 29 employees, and we source material from over 350 suppliers, and we sell to nearly 150 consumers, many of you here in this room. We do have a warehouse in Toledo for mixed loads. The main auto alloys that are found in the scrap stream, and for many of you, this is not news. You've become familiar with all these alloys here, 5754 and other 5000 series, 6005, 6005A, 6016, 6022, 6111. The interesting thing, and then of course when they're mixed, the interesting thing is that most of us in this room had probably never heard of any of these alloys about 5 or 6 years ago. They were just, you know, if someone walked in your door and wanted to offer you 6111, you had no idea what it was they were talking about. As a percentage of our annual volume, you can see what I'm talking about. We started seeing a little bit of the auto sheet in 2012. In 2013, overall, our volume was around 134 million pounds. 3% of that volume was this auto sheet, were these grades. 2014, it grew to 7%. And you could see in 2016, we recycled over 147 million pounds of scrap, and about 25 million pounds of that was auto sheet, about 17%. Now for us, that was the high point in percentage. Last year, about 11.6%, and those of you in the room who are handling this will understand what I'm talking about as I go forward as to why it may have dropped off a little bit. Year over year, what we realized in the beginning was it made sense to us that we would just go right back to the people that were producing this sheet. You know, we're being offered 6022. We knew it was produced by Novelis or Alcoa at the time, now Arconic. Why wouldn't they just buy it right back? Well, it wasn't that easy. They were handling a lot of it in closed loop. And so our job as a broker in the beginning was to figure out who could consume this. And a lot of it was mixed, 5,000 and 6,000 series. So in 2013, you can see that the majority of the metal that we moved went to secondary smelters. We were able to place some at billet casters and very, very little at sheet mills. And as you go forward through the years, in 2016, you can see that the majority of what we placed was at billet casters, was people who are making 6061, 6063. These alloys, they figured out how to use it and how it could work into making those alloys. And there was a switch. And you can see in 2017, the real big change, we still moved roughly the same amount to billet casters between 16 and 17, but the big change was that there was very little going to the secondaries. And I think that had more to do with market dynamics. So I told you this would be the abridged version. Now, one of the conclusions that I'm going to talk about is that in the beginning we were told, and many of you in this room, you were probably offered some of this to handle it as an industrial account. And I came to a meeting a number of years ago, and I heard someone speak. Actually, he's in the room, Kevin Moore. I heard him speak at a conference. And Kevin said, there's going to be a revolution with the F-150, and there's going to be all this auto sheet, and it's going to be great for the aluminum market. So I went home and I educated myself on all of these alloys, but I was told, don't worry about it, because it's all going to be handled in a closed loop. It's never going to hit the open market. Well, the conclusion that we came to was closed loop. I know Arconic and Novellus are in the audience somewhere. Those of us in the room know that there is a lot of this material out there, and it is not being handled in a closed loop. I'm sure there's plenty, and I'm sure the amount they're handling, I couldn't even wrap my brain around. But those of us who are in the scrap industry, we're getting offered this material like crazy and struggling to find places to go with it. There is plenty left in the open market. Also, billet casters find value in the auto scrap as a substitute for 6061 scrap, which is great, right? Except when you logically think about that, if you're using it as a substitute, what are they likely going to be buying less of? So something has been displaced in the market. And sheet mills will pretty much not even want to talk to you about this unless it is segregated. They don't want to handle the mixed grade, which is the majority of it. All right, spreads, probably skip that last part there since that was at a different type of event. Won't talk about spreads. So that was a very, very quick version since we had the time to try to give you maybe a little bit more meat. If you have any questions on auto sheet, I'm happy to take them here. So we are going to open up to questions for Jason and Leo. We have roughly about a half hour for questions. And if you are going to ask a question, I'm going to ask that you come to one of the microphones to please ask your question. And I'll be happy to start out with one for Jason while you're working your way up to the microphone. For those of us in the audience, over the last couple weeks, we've seen a dramatic rise, really a historic rise in the price of aluminum on the London Metal Exchange. And it was spurred by these sanctions on Rusal. So if you could explain in layman terms exactly what happened and why that's affecting us, and then how do you think it's ultimately going to play out?
So the short answer is that this is tied to two things. So first is the Russian interference in the U.S. presidential election in 2016, and also in Europe, what the issues with Ukraine and the territories currently under Russian control. So as a result of these, sanctions were issued on about a couple dozen different Russian oligarchs and their entities and holdings, one of which includes Rusal. And so the concern is, what's going to happen with the metal? Financially, can transactions happen as a counterparty because of the sanctions involved? So there's multiple layers of complexity to it, but basically the market was, and I mentioned in my slides, both fundamentals and technicals are important. And the fundamentals, against the backdrop of trade sanctions, had turned bearish. And the technicals had followed it lower. So while I talked about the 120 as the number to watch for equity markets that we look at, we watch the 30 and the 100-day for aluminum prices as critical supports. And aluminum prices were at the lowest level in over 8 months, like something like 8.5 months, and so we ended up, closing out last month at the lowest levels in 9 months. So, this is a market that was under a lot of bearish pressure, both fundamentally and technically, and then you had suddenly a concern that people couldn't get the metal they needed. And as a result, there was a lot of short covering, I think, that followed the fundamental turn and risk and concern about supply, which turned what would have been a small pop into a much bigger one, because you had people who were short because of the fundamentals. They had to cover the shorts, causes the spike goes up, you suddenly cross the 30, you cross the 100, suddenly, like I said, the technicals, the algo traders that are using formulas, buy, and, here we are. I would say that there were further upside risks because Nikki Haley had said there were going to be additional Russian sanctions as a result or in response to Russian support of Syrian use of gas, Russian support of Syria, and in the wake of Syria's, gas attack and the conflict there. And that was going to come on Monday, and that was walked back, and that did not happen. What happens next is going to be quite a tenuous thing, and that's why I say it's, there are times when it's more and less pleasant to forecast. What I'd say is that the tail ends of the distribution for the potentials are much wider. You could very easily make a case for 2,800. I could very easily make a case for 1,800. And that would be in a short window. I would say that the longer this goes, think about it. The sanctions on Iran were there for years, right? If the sanctions are there for years, then this is going to be a problem for a little while, even if the global economy slows. But I think many of us have also seen that conflict minerals tend to find their way into the supply chain. And so as far as a shortage is concerned, I'm perhaps less concerned about that in the medium term, and I'm still more concerned about the global trade aspect. In either case, this situation increases the inflationary pressures they alluded to. That affects manufacturer profit margins, that affects also Fed and production inflation. So those are generally the things, the situation, by the way, with Russia is not fully resolved. So NAFTA feeds into this as well. And let me add one more wrinkle. So for trade risks, while we talk about the U.S.-Chinese trade relations sort of lobbing things back and forth, the bigger thing to think about is what's going to happen with NAFTA. Millions of U.S. jobs are tied to it. It's a big part of U.S. trade, North American trade. These are really big issues. What most people don't know is there are 30 chapters of NAFTA. Only 6 have been concluded. There are 24 not completed. The next election that's going to be material will be the Mexican election on July 1st. And if there were to be Russian interference there, these sanctions could be pushed further. And by the way, if you think Facebook clicks are super cheap in the US, your cost per click, your CPC in Mexico is going to be even lower. And, Facebook kept the money, right? So, it's not like they're not going to keep it again. So I'm concerned that, we've seen this movie once. We've actually probably seen it a couple times. That if this plays out again, we have PSYOPs, which psychological operations interference. We see that kind of thing play out, then the sanctions on aluminum could stick longer if that's detected. And I think there's a high probability that that sort of thing will happen. It all goes back to an old Russian proverb, which is there's a Russian peasant, and he finds a bottle, rubs it, and a genie comes out. The genie tells the Russian peasant, you can have one wish, anything you want. And the peasant says, my neighbor has a cow. I want you to kill my neighbor's cow. This makes me think of what could happen in the NAFTA situation in the Mexican election, let alone what might happen politically or change-ups with the midterms.
Okay. Joe?
Thanks. And thanks to all three of you gentlemen for your presentations today. We really appreciate it. I had a question for Mr. Liu, if I may. We hear a lot about Category 7 scrap, but it's not always clear what that constitutes. When it comes to aluminum scrap, could you give our audience a sense of what aluminum scrap would be included in Category 7 versus what would be excluded from Category 7? Thank you.
Okay. Actually, about the Category 7, for the aluminum scrap, there are two kinds of aluminum scrap when you import in China. It have two custom code. One is we say it Category 6, which is free to trade, free to import. That means and another is Category 7. The Category 7 is mainly of the cables and wires and the electric motors and some hardwares. That's mainly Category 7. And the others, for example, Zobas, something like this, are Category 6.
Zorba would be in 6?
Yeah, Zorba is always in 6.
Same, and that's the same with Twitch and...
Yeah.
All right.
But also you have to meet this new environmental standard that the carried waste is less than 1%. It's no matter you are in Category 6 or Category 7.
Okay. I guess this is probably for Jason, but how much investment in new or restarted aluminum production are you expecting in the wake of whether it's the 232 tariffs or some of these sanctions forcing pricing up? And how much does the uncertainty on the trade front impact these decisions?
So there are a couple things on this point. One is, we're going to see a little more here. We don't specifically forecast this kind of investment at the macro level, so I think this is also maybe a question that was grandfathered in from the previous panel we had expected. But what I would say is, as we think about the tariffs, there's a couple things that most people don't understand that I would share. And I'll give the example of steel because it applies to aluminum, but there are a number of companies that I work with in the rack industry that this is an acute issue on the steel side, but it's similar in aluminum. So let me give you the example. So the products coming out of China, racks, by the way, if we think of like Amazon warehouses, so there's steel racks that hold everything. So let's say that the racks that you might buy, it's 85% maybe of the OpEx of the companies is in the steel cost. Stuff coming out of China is 20, 30% cheaper. Okay, so the Chinese stuff, 20 to 30% cheaper than the US. The US manufacturer now will pay more for the steel, and so therefore, their price might now be, the Chinese price might now be 50% less. Because there's no tariff on an import of the finished good, only on the raw metal. So this is what people aren't thinking about, and this is why there's another 1,300 tariffs up for consideration, is because if the goal is to protect the aluminum and steel industry in the US, per the 232, for national security concerns, in order to protect and preserve a certain amount of materiel, which is military-grade metals for use, then the goal is to get a high level of capacity utilization. The capacity utilization, however, would be greatly impacted if companies that already are producing goods more expensive than what comes out of China, and then their cost basis goes up and they go out of business. It's very tough to keep your utilization rate up if the companies that actually buy your product are gone. Which means, from a tariff standpoint, this is why there's never just one cockroach, then you get the risk of, well, maybe there needs to be tariffs then added on finished product, otherwise you begin to decimate manufacturing. So these are, I would say, wrinkles of consideration because you think, well, gee, it's very profitable and the price is very high and the demand for aluminum or the demand for steel, these are going to be very high. and there's a cost differential that's very favorable. But if the customers at the end of the day that buy this stuff are gone, then you know, the industry would still be at risk.
Randy?
Yeah, my question, I guess, is to Jason predominantly, but what is affecting currently and for the near future more, impacting us more? The situations going on with China with both the regulation changes and the tariff and the potential trade war, or the Russian side of this with Rusal, with Russia, and with that side of it? Which one is really playing on the market more than the other at this point?
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Randy. So I would say the first issue is, you know, throughout March, the concern about the U.S.-China trade lobbing of tariffs back and forth was the bigger concern, which is why the price of aluminum got hammered down. Rusal obviously has had this big snapback impact. That could continue to be quite more of a short-term phenomenon. But you know, as we look further out, I'd say that, you know, the global growth dynamics are still going to be very important. And if this, you know, yields a continued problem, you know, we continue to see walking back the tariffs to be more challenging. That's something most people don't realize. You know, there are two main narratives right now about the tariffs, and they're often sort of politicized views. But on the one hand, there's the argument that the trade situation in the U.S. is not fair. The president is trying to get a better deal, and he's a tough negotiator, and this is what he's doing. The other narrative is that international relations are not real estate transactions, and things can spiral out of control with second and third order impacts that are unexpected. It is quite very possible that both narratives prove correct. They're both at the same time. There is truth. And this is a bit of a problem because when we think about the position of China, most people don't realize something. I haven't heard anyone, and I talked to people about tariffs for the last 2 months until my, you know, I would say I had no more to say, but you guys know me better than that. But, you know, really, I've talked to everybody about tariffs. And the one thing that most people don't realize is, why do emerging markets have higher tariffs in the U.S.? In the U.S., our per capita income is almost $58,000 per person. Any idea what it is in China? It's about $8,000. The reason there are tariffs for emerging market economies is because by allowing them in place, it allows emerging economies to grow to a level that they eventually have the strength, the demand, and the economic stability to buy our more expensive stuff. And if China takes a long-term outlook on this, walking back their tariffs when there's a $50,000 per capita differential in income per year is not something I think they're going to be okay with.
Okay. Leo, I think if I read it right in your slide, you said that last year China imported 618,000 metric tons of aluminum scrap. Is that?
From U.S.?
From the U.S.?
Yeah, yeah.
All right. So with these tariffs that went in place in early April, how do you think that China is going to, where are they going to look to either replace those units, or how are they going to avoid those costs?
Oh, I think if they, first, if they actually pay the actual cost, they have no competitive capacity to compete in the market. So they have to looking for the another options. The first option, I think, is the processing trade. If you trade under processing trade, you don't need to pay the tariff.
Okay.
Okay. But the processing trade, every company which doing processing trade have quotas, so they don't have enough quotas. And the second is, I think maybe you can re-export from, for example, Hong Kong and also, as far as I know, many companies are looking to set plants in Southeast Asia. So they can import from the USA and do some sorting and then ship the clean scraps to China to meet the demand. I think for short term.
Right. So just to reiterate, just to make sure I heard you correctly, if they bring it in and it's deemed that they're processing the material, they're melting it into something else that is going into another product, they don't have to pay the tariffs on it.
Yeah.
Okay, so they can't bring in something, they're paying the tariffs on the traditional items that they used to hand sort.
Yeah.
That's where they would pay the tariffs.
Sorry?
Yeah?
I'm not sure of the exact.
I mean, the processing trade is that, for example, I import the scrap from US and I export the ingots to
Okay.
US. I don't need to pay the.
Gotcha. So when you're converting it into something else.
Yeah, okay.
Got it. That makes sense. And then the second part is, you think they're going to set up plants in Vietnam or Korea or other countries, right? Okay. All right. Yes, sir.
Yes, I was just wondering if you think that the tariffs in the current situation will encourage more yards to sort materials to try to leverage the higher price since they have lower volumes, or if you think this will largely not affect that thought process.
To sort more of the material that was traditionally going to China? Is that your question?
Well, if the volume is decreasing on the amount of scrap and you're no longer at max capacity, I would think that most people would say use that excess capacity to sort and get a higher value product out rather than just shipping a mixed.
Oh, you're talking about the auto sheet?
Yeah, well, just having a general mixed load of scrap versus a sorted load of scrap.
In theory, yes. If we're talking specifically about auto sheet, what I was referring to, it's mixed and the technology hasn't caught up to be able to sort it yet. There are companies, I think Steinert is one of them, that is working on technology to sort the 5 from the 6000 series, but I don't think it's ready for prime time yet. And you can't really hand sort it unless it's big, like hoods. That you can hand sort with a handheld analyzer and go through and do that. In terms of the scrap that's been going to China, I'm curious about that too. I mean, I'm curious as to are those of us in the room, are we going to, if we lose the ability to just throw stuff in a container, not throw it in a container, but if we lose the ability to move the lower grade units to China, what are we going to do in terms of technology, and what are we going to do in terms of man hours when the labor market is already tight? So I think it's a challenge right now. Sorry, if I didn't answer your question the correct way, I apologize. I'm not sure that that's what you were after. All right, in general, for both of you, when you think about aluminum and you think about whether it's trade with China or aluminum in general, what keeps you up at night? What are you worried about? And going forward, obviously, Rusal was a surprise to all of us, the way it's affected the market, but barring another crazy surprise, if we get back to normalcy, what keeps you up at night? What are you concerned about with regard to aluminum going forward?
I mean, I would echo some of my comments for my presentation. The reason I put those numbers up there is those are probably the numbers I'd continue to watch. Global growth, wage inflation, trading technicals, and what happens with productivity and the monthly manufacturing indices. I mean, I would say that right now, probably one of my biggest concerns is that we have enough kind of weird stuff going on that, you begin to kind of pile on and you can see some unpleasant scenarios for growth, which of course, again, aluminum bought not sold, hurts aluminum, you can very easily see that. I think what keeps me up at night is I have trouble seeing the upside from where we were, say, in February. Even if we could dial it back, it's kind of tough seeing the upside with so many other cost pressures rising. And we're at a certain point in the business cycle that probably makes me concerned. It makes me more concerned. And actually, this is probably something that should, so that's what keeps me up at night. What should keep you up at night is a conversation I had with the board of one of my clients, a private company. We met at the beginning of February, not in this industry. There were a dozen people at the table. And there were a couple of the senior executives, and then the rest of the board was there, and the staff, the senior staff. And we were talking about these risks that were apparent in February with the inflationary pressures and labor costs, the interest rates, commodity prices, the whole thing. And the CEO says to me, well, you know, we've seen this before. And I looked around the room, there were 12 of us, and I said, 3 of us have seen this before. There were 9 people at the table who had not been working during a previous business cycle. They don't know what it looks like. They don't know how the movie ends, right? To them, this is the Sixth Sense, and we all know how it all ends. And so I would encourage you, everybody talks about these intergenerational workforces, millennial stuff, like whatever. Consider the fact that there's a lot of these folks in the workforce who've never seen a cycle. There were people who had made managing director at Goldman Sachs who had never seen a Fed funds rate above 0. So, as you think about market risk, the sort of stuff we're talking about, these kind of tail end events, these kind of trade issues haven't even been a subject for 20-something years. And, here we are. I did not expect I did not think this was the year of tariffs. I'm just, as far as things I'd be talking about with my clients, higher interest rates, yes, risk of the tight labor market, yes, but, to think that this would be where we are, and then sanctions on top of tariffs, on top of, it gets to be a bit much. But what I would encourage you to think of is as you talk to your staffs about these kinds of risks and you think about your own strategic planning, is to consider that the folks that work for you and work with you may not have seen how higher interest rates play out. They might not know that higher interest rates slow auto sales, slow home sales. They might not know that the Fed and the European Central Bank, which still has negative deposit rates, when inflation starts coming, these guys start gunning for it. Something to keep in mind.
And what do you think that is your biggest worry with regard to aluminum?
Yeah, for the aluminum scrap, in March, the most concern is about the environmental standard, can limit the standard of 1%. But about 1 month and a half, as I said before, this seems to be not very influential. For the pre-shipment inspection, it's much serious, but totally for the influence of the industry, I think not very big. But in this month, this tariff thing is, we are still asking our members to feedback the opinions. Before this policy released, we also be inquired to offer our opinions. We try to persuade the government that maybe the aluminum scrap is not the best option. Maybe you can choose another, or maybe you can delay to postpone your tariff effective date. But the government sees a big picture. It's not decided by our CMI. We only have opinions, but it's not decided by us. So we still take great care about this thing and see what will happen.
Well, thank you for going to bat for us. We appreciate that. And Andrew, I won't talk about specific credit, because that would be antitrust. But one thing that I would say that might keep me up at night right now would be credit risk within this space. With what we do, if you think about, we have higher prices that we're selling at. So we're selling the scrap at a higher price than we were a month, 2 months ago. The people that we sell to probably were hedging their inventory. So therefore, they're getting margin call after margin call after margin call from their broker. So a lot of their cash is being eaten up with margin calls. And then they have these receivables to us, these payables to us. And, obviously I can't guide anyone in here what to do. I just know that we are watching our credit very closely and tightly right now and rechecking those of you who carry credit insurance, I'm sure you're updating it, and it's probably a smart move. So that didn't violate anything, did it? All right, good.
Can I add one more thing to that, Matt? Because I know you've
Sure.
got these nightmares. I don't mean to pile on and make them worse, but there's something else to consider too as you think about these credit risks and the cost to float everything and your exposures. As interest rates rise, that gets more expensive. So they're going to go up before they go down, which increases that exposure and vulnerability.
Right. So if there are no further questions, then I am going to, this is the last call for alcohol. Last call for a question.
Don't tease them about the alcohol.
All right, well, I'm giving them the opportunity to, before Copper, they can go get a quick drink. So Copper is coming up at 3:30, will be moderated by Mr. Randy Goodman. I think Joe is on the panel, Ed Muir, and I'm missing one more. Tim Streltz from California. All right, and the non-Ferris reception will be right out here. All right, and that is beginning at 5 p.m. Beginning at 5 p.m. So I want to thank Jason and Leo for coming to speak to us today. If we could thank them and wrap it up. Thank you very much.